And Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jen with the Hamilton Naturalists Club.
We also have Dr. Linda Lukasic, who is going to be our tech support and monitoring working. Let's get started. Officially 6:06. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. We're super excited about the excitement of it all. We set this up not even a week ago and got such a great response. And this is Bella, my cat, who loves it when I'm on Zoom. And she likes to just make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So welcome. My name is Juby. I'm with Environment Hamilton. And Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jen with the Hamilton Naturalists Club.
We also have Dr. Linda Lukasic, who is going to be our tech support and monitoring the chat for us because she is awesome. Linda, you raised your hand. Did you want to pop in and say something?
That was my hello.
Oh. Thanks, Linda. So it's so great to see so many familiar names and new names, new friends. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just a bit of housekeeping. We are recording this. Please just put your questions in the chat. That's the best way of communicating with us. We're going to be stopping at key points through this presentation to look at some of the questions that have been asked. And at the end, we'll share we have an action sheet, and I will email out to you the link to this webinar, the action sheet, some other links. And yeah, I think away we go. So Jen and I are going to be co-presenting, so you'll hear from both of us as we go through the draft. And let's get started officially. Did it work? Oh wait, hold on. Oh, is this how this works? Okay, I figured out the buttons I need to press. Okay, so this is our agenda. It's very brief. We'll hopefully wrap up around 7:30. The first thing we want to do was to do a land acknowledgement. Since we are unable to gather in person, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm situated on at home here today in Hamilton. It's the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Tract, 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, that was returned to the Six Nations of the Grand River by the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. The larger territory of Southern Ontario is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas that bound them to peacefully share the territory and protect the land. The single spoon reflects the need to share and to ensure that the bowl is never empty. This refers to taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. There are no knives, indicating the need to protect and share in peace. Subsequent Indigenous nations and other peoples were invited into this covenant in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I am grateful for the opportunity to gather on this territory, even virtually, and to work in this community. Through this land acknowledgement, my intent is to honor and show gratitude to the original stewards of the land as a sign of respect and willingness to learn and heal. Together, may we care for this land and for each other, and being mindful of generations to come. So speaking of keeping in mind generations to come, we're here to talk about trees and the city's draft urban forest strategy. We're excited that you're all here with us as we walk through the draft. And this great quote from George Monbiot, that trees are these magic machines, and it's true. They literally are magical. And we know many of you already know this. Trees are important, and there are many reasons why. They do great things for us. They help improve our air quality. They support biodiversity. They increase our climate resiliency. They will help us meet our city's goal to reduce climate emissions by 30% by the year 2050. They improve mental health. They help with stormwater management. They decrease urban heat islands. So Jen is going to take over on this next couple of slides.
So Juby mentioned how great trees are, and I think we're all here tonight because we all love trees. And so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what an urban forest is. So we thought we would use the draft or what the definition that's in the draft urban forest strategy. And they say that a Hamilton's urban forest can be defined as all of the trees, whether single trees, groups of trees, or woodlands that are found on public and private land within the urban boundary. So that's what we're talking about tonight. And for our oh, thank you. I clicked it on my second screen. And so for Hamilton's urban forest, we wanted to share some of the things that we already know, and as well as some of the things that the research showed in the urban forest strategy. So our tree canopy coverage is around 21%. And within that, we know that's part of our Carolinian forest. We know that in Hamilton, we're in part of a biodiversity hotspot, and that includes our urban forest. So we see remnants of this Carolinian forest within some of our urban pockets here and there. And so that's where some of our 70 different native trees come from, which, so we have some good diversity in our trees. A lot of that lies within the Niagara Escarpment, which is this tremendous band of forest that we have going through our city that is just an incredible resource. So, that urban forest is wonderful. But then we look at the top 3 species of trees identified in the urban forest strategy, and then things are maybe not as great. So the top 3 species are eastern white cedars, so that's all of our hedges that lots of us have, white ash, and buckthorn. And then the top leaf area is black walnut, Norway maple, and Manitoba maple. So the highlighted species are invasive. So it's kind of concerning that our 3 of our top species are invasive species. Manitoba maple, some people do consider invasive, so that's why I hit the list. We wanted to share that. Another key point that is really important to keep in mind throughout this discussion is that 50% of our urban trees are on private lands. So anything that's going to happen around our urban forest has to include private lands. We can't just depend on public lands for this. And then, so Juby talked about, like some of the great benefits that we get from our trees. And when we look at it collectively as an urban forest, we can calculate what some of those benefits that we get are. And if we look at the ecosystem services of our urban forest, and all of this is in the draft urban forest strategy. So with ecosystem services, we're looking at pollution removal. So how our trees capture air particulate, so to help clean our air, help to clean the water as water filters through tree roots, help to manage stormwater that we'll talk about in a second. All of these great benefits that we get are calculated at around $8.2 million each year. Trees also help with stormwater runoff, so something that is a big concern for our community. So they help to kind of hold in some of the water during rainwater or rain events. So kind of like a rain garden can do that. Trees can help with that as well. And so out of our urban trees, it's looking like that is a service that our trees provide us at around almost $2 million each year. And then our energy savings. So if those of you have big trees that help to shade your houses, you'll know that you really notice that in the summer because your house is a lot cooler. Maybe you don't have to turn the air on at all, or maybe it can be lower. So you see those benefits. Well, trees help with that. And so those benefits are around $3.5 million each year. So this is the work that our urban forest at 21% canopy cover is providing for us each year.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So there's lots of great information in the draft. This is a map that's found in the draft. It's calculations of the canopy coverage by ward. And the one thing we want folks to note is that these calculations include spaces like the escarpments. And you know, if we look at places like Ward 1, there's a tree canopy coverage of about 32%. But that includes a lot of these large trees that were planted about the same time. We have, you know, we have swaths of city trees that were, you know, that started as elm trees, and then when they fell, it was the ash trees, and now we know what's happening with the ash trees. So these numbers are impacted by those kinds of things. And if we look at Ward 5, the tree canopy coverage is at 27.4, and we know that includes the Red Hill. And, you know, places like Ward 8 have terribly low number of 7.6 tree canopy coverage in that ward. We know that most of the trees are concentrated in like park spaces. So if you don't have access to a park space easily, you're not really going to access the benefits of trees. So what we would really like to see is really hyper-local data. One of our concerns is around equity and equal coverage. And so having really specific data would actually help inspire and drive us. So while looking at what other cities have done around their tree canopies, we found this report that was created in 2010 or 2012. So you can see in image 1 is the existing tree canopy coverage broken up by their suburbs. So the Bronx is at 23%, Queens is at 18% at the time of this report. Then they went back and they looked at possible vegetated locations where more trees could be planted, and they did calculations. So Bronx's existing tree canopy coverage of 23% could actually become 41%. And Queens' existing tree canopy coverage of 18 could become 45%, so on and so forth. I do want to note that possible vegetation locations, they just kind of did a cursory look at it. They didn't necessarily look to see, you know, the future plans of those locations, of those possible right-of-ways or fields, etc. But it gives us a good idea of what is possible. And then in the same report, they actually went through by neighborhood. So existing tree canopy coverage in image 1, you can see, for instance, Central Park, already green space. It's already at like 61%. But with additional, looking at the possible vegetation locations, that Central Park could increase to 83 or 84%. The one I want to highlight is the one with the little pink star, the Marine Park Floyd Bennett Field in the corner there. Their tree canopy coverage was calculated to be about 16%, 16%. Looking at all the possible locations, that number actually increased to 72%. So, you know, that's a goal right there. You know, think about if you knew in your neighborhood what the existing canopy coverage was and what it could possibly be and the impact of that. I think, you know, this kind of data would help. It would help drive us and inspire us. Another thing that this report talked about was the importance of our street trees. So they talked about how in a lot of our densely built neighborhoods, these trees represent most of the urban canopy coverage. This makes them an important part of the character of these neighborhoods. And while the street trees only accounted for about 3.2% of the total tree population, they represented about 24% of the forest value. So while they're a small number, they actually benefit us much more exponentially. They also in the report identified about 37,000 potential planting sites for street trees. And so there's another avenue that we could look at in terms of how to, you know, where to plant more trees. So gaining community support for these tree planting locations and these right-of-ways will be a very important part of us greening our streets. So we're going to just take a moment. Linda, are there any questions here? And if you have questions, put them in the chat. If you have questions afterwards that you didn't get a chance or we didn't get a chance to answer, you can always email me and we'll try our best.
Yeah, Juby, there are some questions. So I have a question from Zoe Green. Zoe asks, do you know the source of the New York City canopy data? Likely more detailed than what's typically available in Southern Ontario?
Well, I do have the link. I can send the link in, will that be helpful if I just emailed the link of that report in the email I send out to folks? Should we just do it that way? Yeah.
Great.
Sorry, yeah.
And there is another question from John Davey. John's question is, does the 18% canopy coverage include the escarpment forest? If so, do we know what the percentage would be if we didn't have that included?
So the calculation for urban Hamilton is at 21%, and it's looking at about 18% without the escarpment. Does that make sense?
And then in your neighborhood, if it was 18% for your neighborhood, and if the escarpment runs through your neighborhood, yes, it would include the escarpment. And one of the things that we want to ask, because this is just a draft report, is can we get the numbers for neighborhoods with the escarpment not included? So that we don't have that information at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yes. It's the same for Dundas. So we think it would be really important and valuable information to have is, what is our urban forest without that? I'm in Ward 1, we have the escarpment running right through. So I would like to know, because I don't think it's 40% everywhere without the escarpment.
Yeah, and just to add there, because I don't think everyone can see Stan Novak's comment. So he was just commenting on Dundas, and he said the same goes for Ward 13 Dundas at 40+%, as we have the escarpment on 3 sides of us. And I do have another question from Anne Washington. Anne asks, what has been happening to the tree canopies in Westdale? Some years ago, it was being assessed.
Jen, do you have something?
Sure. So Westdale was assessed a number of years ago through trees count, and then a bit more recently, but still a few years ago, when the more updated Trees Please project started. And so what we know is there are a lot of similar age silver maples across Westdale. So that's a bit of a concern because they're all the same age. They're all going to start dying at the same time. And we need to see like what is the plan going to be, and can we get more trees planted, before all of them die. We also know that there are a number of super impressive oaks in Westdale.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions.
Sure.
Sumarki asks, how healthy are the street trees and how effective can they be since they are surrounded by concrete?
That's a good question. So in the draft, they said that about over 80% of the trees that were inventoried were in good condition. So that's good. How long they will be in good condition for is that's something that's definitely a concern around tree maintenance and how we care for our trees that we already have. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Anne. I hope so.
Okay, great. Ruth C has a question. She said she'd like to hear what the city knows about permeable versus traditional paving and the battle between those who want boulevard parking permits but can't due to the presence of city trees. This results in illegal tree removal to put in driveways to increase house resale value. I would like to encourage the building department to consider alternative paving methods to enable trees to coexist with driveways versus being cut down. What do you guys know about such an initiative? I have seen many trees illegally cut in my neighborhood, and there's a sad frowny face.
Yes, and so I can imagine, because a friend of mine almost did the same thing until I put a stop to that. And so I don't think we have details about it, but I think that would be a really good question for the city's consultation about, so this tonight is what we are seeing about the city's draft urban forest strategy. The city is holding its own consultation on Tuesday evening, and I think that would be a really good question to ask the city directly.
We have, we have another question from Stan. He asks, have trees count studies been done in all wards? If so, where can we access that information?
That's a great question, Stan. They've all been great questions. So Stan, there's been some tree counts that have been happening. I started actually, years ago with Environment Hamilton doing trees count in Dundas. We then have combined forces starting in 2016 with Environment Hamilton and the Hamilton Naturalists Club doing trees please, tree inventorying. We're in our 9th neighborhood. So the data that we have with that is found on our website at Environment Hamilton's website under our projects and trees please. And I can definitely send a link out as well. You can find the tree data that we have, as well as some of the air quality data that we've been collecting. But we've definitely not been in all the wards. We've definitely not been in the 200 neighborhoods that make up our city. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
So we have lots of questions coming in both the chat and the Q&A. So I'm going to jump back and forth between both. And maybe I know that there are some questions, Juby and Jen, that I know will be addressed in the presentation. So I think I'll leave it to you to decide how you want to deal with those. So we have one from Donald Trant who asks, what is the optimal canopy coverage you should try to achieve?
That's a great question, Donald. And we are definitely, we're definitely pushing for 45%. So in our official plan, it's 30%, but we're aiming high. This is it. This is the time to do it. Aim high.
All right, and now a question from Thomas Broen. He asks, is there a strategy to deal with invasive trees? On the escarpment, there are a lot of Norway maples, for example.
Yes, there are, and no, there is not a strategy. And we're going to talk about that a bit more like in a few minutes. We'll be talking about invasives and urban woodlands. And I guess just briefly, I'll say now that invasive species are addressed in the draft urban strategy as being something that needs to be developed, and that an invasive species strategy needs to be developed as part of this initiative. And that's so it's in the strategy, and we're going to talk a bit more about it in a few minutes.
Okay, and we have a question from Nancy Hurst. She says she often sees new trees dying of thirst due to lack of aftercare. Why do they plant and neglect?
Good question, Nancy. We wonder the same thing. And so talking about maintenance is something that we're going to do in a few minutes as well, because that is, as critical as getting a tree planted is taking care of it. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. You guys are like ahead of us.
Yeah.
We have another question from Lam. Are there any goals for equitable tree planting so that plantable spaces with underserviced communities are prioritized?
Yes, Lam, we're definitely we definitely are talking about that in a few minutes. That is definitely a concern of ours for sure.
Okay. Dan Avstu asks, do you know how the value of tree services was calculated?
I don't know those details, but it would be in, because lots of people use lots of different calculators, but it would be in the urban forest strategy itself about how they came up with those numbers.
Yeah,
and could be another question for the city on Tuesday.
Looks like they used iTree data and just like plotting out certain like random plots of trees to collect some of their data. But very specifically, iTree generally, we're using iTree through Trees Please and doing our tree inventorying, and you plug in a number of things, tree identification, and then the measurements are what generates these economic values. And I suspect that's how they used it, just using iTree.
Okay, and then I have another question, and this one is from Environment Hamilton, so I think it might be Beatrice, one of our co-workers. Can you talk about targets? By how much are we aiming to increase the canopy, and by when? Also wondering if the types of trees that we are planting today will be able to thrive in our changing climate.
That's a good question. So right now on the official plan, tree canopy coverage, the goal is 30% by 2050. And that is not enough for us. We are pushing for 45. And we know in terms of planting trees that, that are more acclimatized to like much warmer weather. We know forestry, for instance, forestry has been amazing. They're already thinking about these things, and they've started to plant things like Kentucky coffee trees, knowing that they are much better with warmer environments. So they're making moves on that level. I hope that answers your question, Beatrice.
Okay, we have another question. This one is from John Hanna. Hi, John. Is there a known percentage of invasive non-native species and a plan to address the remaining availability? And he has in brackets local suppliers.
Hi, John. Good question. So I guess I could say that I have a plan, but the city doesn't have a plan at this point to address invasives. The only plan is what's mentioned in the draft urban forest strategy, that invasives are bad and need to be addressed. And I guess I do know that when the city has been sourcing trees, they have been sourcing from local native tree suppliers, particularly for trees that are going into parks. And then whenever I do a planting, it's all from local suppliers. So hopefully out of part of this, we can increase the discussion around managing invasives, and then clearing out space so that we can get more native species planted. And if it can be part of a plan, then that then will help our native plant suppliers to kind of forecast what is coming up. So, a bunch of reasons why we need things to be planned, especially when hopefully it can happen at a broader scale than just like what I'm able to do with a bunch of volunteers.
Okay, next question is from Aaron. Aaron says, it has been noticed that many new street trees being planted are understory trees, and understory trees don't provide much shade. How can we encourage homeowners to plant canopy trees in rear yards?
That's a great question. We know through Trees Please, we've done a number of free tree giveaways, and especially in the very urban places, the first ones to go are the most that are requested are small trees for sure. And we always ensure that we have, through our free tree giveaways, a list that include large trees, medium sized, small, and shrubs. And it was interesting because when we did our big tree giveaway, where we gave out 600 trees last year, the number of larger trees actually skewed. Normally it goes like the most requested trees are the small trees, but this last year was actually, it kind of switched. It was much higher ratio of requests for big trees. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I think people are interested in larger trees. We just need to make sure that they're planted in the right spots. We know that with the city street tree program, the free tree that the city will plant on the city right away, they will go out and their investigator looks at like 40 pieces of the puzzle before they make a decision or a recommendation of what trees should go in there, including the other kinds of trees in the neighborhood, and if they're overhead wires, etc., things like that. But definitely, we are about planting different trees, native trees of different heights and sizes. And that's, something we talk to forestry about. That's something we try and do in practice. Yeah. I don't know, Jen, you have more to add.
I think if we just keep these conversations going, so if we're talking to people and we're like, oh, hey, you would have a space for an oak in your space. Have you ever considered putting like what will become a big tree. So if we keep those conversations going, and then one of the things that we're hoping to see in the urban forest strategy is that when developers and contractors plant trees, they look at what is the largest tree that they can plant that will fit in that space. So if you can fit an oak in that space, plant an oak, don't plant a serviceberry. If a serviceberry or an understory tree is what will fit in that space, then plant. But if you can plant a better tree, a bigger tree, then do it. Is one of the things that we're asking for as part of the urban forest strategy. In places, so this is places where trees need to be planted and have to be planted. So if we can just make that a rule that when the planting is happening, it's native species, locally sourced ideally, and the biggest tree that will fit at maturity in the space.
This question is from Jason Morris. Jason asks, is there a breakdown of native versus non-native street trees, both existing and planned? And then I'm just going to add, because he's got a second part here. Also, is there recognition of native versus non-native in terms of ecological value, aside from invasive?
So in terms of the city's, I guess, street tree list, I think that's maybe what is native and invasive. I'm actually not sure. Like most of the tree, and Juby might know that a bit more, but in terms of the ecological value, we know that the trees that become like super canopy or canopy trees provide the most ecological value. So, you know, where we can get those planted, that we already know that's what's going to be. And, you know, a lot of those trees also then provide the best bang for wildlife as well. In terms of other specific details, we need to look at it tree by tree. Sorry, I don't know that like off the top of my head, but we know that the trees that become super canopy are the ones that provide the most ecological value for those ecosystem services that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from anonymous attendee, and they ask, was there or is there plans to work with Indigenous communities in planting and protecting culturally significant trees?
That is a good question. And in the draft, they don't include that. We do know that the city with the Red Hill, they included that turtle pad that we had organized a community tree planting with. Turtle pad. So there is some of that happens, but it is not. That is actually a great question that I don't think is addressed either in the draft or even the only thing I can think about in terms of like, you know, trees, like original trees, is that, you know, we've been talking about heritage tree designation. And I think there's actually like a provincial heritage tree designation. I think we only have one in Hamilton. It's in Dundas. It's a ginormous tulip tree. So in terms of like some sort of designation, that's the only one I can think of. So that's a good point.
And that would be a good question to ask the city on Tuesday. And the way the city has set it up is that we can submit questions ahead of time so that staff will see the question and can then hopefully, I'm hoping the idea is to then come to the session on Tuesday. So, you know, if you have some of these questions that we're not sure about and that, you know, like what is the city thinking, then it would be a good idea to submit those ahead of time to the city.
Mm-hmm.
So Juby and Jen, there are lots more questions. So I can go through a few more, or if you want, if you prefer, you can maybe continue on with the presentation, and I'll certainly track where we're at in the question list so that we don't miss anybody when you pause for more questions. Does that, let me know what you'd like to do.
Yeah, why don't we go on to the next section, because some of it might address maybe some of the questions, I'm not sure. And then at the next question period, we'll get to more questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, because this is where we're going to look at our interpretations of what really jumped out at us from the draft urban forest strategy. So we wanted to talk about the great, the good, and then the gaps. So first thing that's great is just that we have a draft urban forest strategy to talk about. So this has been a long time coming, especially for the Hamilton Naturalists Club. We started talking to the city about this a number of years ago. And when we first started talking, the initial response was no, and that no, we do not need a strategy at all. And so over time with lots of community members, I think a lot of you who are joining us tonight have spoken out, and we've just kept the conversation going. And so now we have an urban forest strategy. In the meantime, between that no and now, an enormous amount of incredible work has been done and is still happening. And I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that. It's not maybe mentioned in the draft strategy. So just the things that have happened, we have our Trees Please program that I think a lot of you are aware of, where we're looking at the different neighborhoods and what's going on with tree canopy coverage and air quality concerns, and where can we get more trees planted. We've had thousands of trees planted over the years, and just in October gave away like 650 trees for folks to plant. And in that time, OPERG through MAC went door to door and talked to people about the city's free street tree program, because lots of people just didn't know about it, had space for a tree, and that resulted in hundreds of trees being planted. This work is still happening now. So we didn't get upset that we couldn't get a strategy and then just stop. We've kept some really good work happening, and now it can go even further with the strategy and hopefully getting some good implementation. So we just wanted to share a bit of the history of how, I guess, we got to where we are right now with our discussion tonight, and then the city's discussion on Tuesday.
Yeah, and shout out to the Naturalist Club for having that vision. These things, they take time, and yeah. So great job.
Thank you.
Another thing that we really like about this strategy that we think is great is the fact that there's lots of great language in it, in terms of, they talk a lot about being bold, being inspiring. For us, it's like we need to aim high. There's lots of great information as well that, talks about the importance of trees and how they provide us so many benefits, including the economic ones that, speak to some people that, might not, that might prioritize economic benefits over other things when looking at infrastructure of the city. We want you to take a moment to just talk about how great the forestry team has been. We have worked alongside them since 2016 consistently with our community tree plantings. We've met, managers, the folks in the office. We've met folks who are on the ground planting those trees, and, consistently they have shown to us that they are thinking about these bigger issues. And so we really appreciate that. We appreciate the senior planner, Kathy Plantz, who is spearheading this whole strategy. She has been consistent with us as well, answering our emails, stakeholder meetings that she has organized outside of this, of some of the public engagement stuff. She has attended meetings, so between, some of these great changes that are happening in the city level and, us as residents and community members, etc., we can have a bold, inspiring plan, and we're excited about that. Another good thing about the plan is that it has some really solid insights. So the consultants looked at tree canopy coverage in certain land use categories. So you can see in the red circles, they looked at industrial lands, they looked at low density residential, they looked at institutional. And you can see in Hamilton that our industrial lands has about 2.3% canopy coverage. When you compare that to London of 12% and Newmarket of 11%. If you look at Hamilton's low density residential, our tree canopy coverage is calculated to be about 18.6%, but in Oakville it's 44%. In London, it's 27%. In Toronto, it's 33%. So those are much higher numbers than what we have in Hamilton. On our institutional lands in Hamilton, the tree canopy coverage is calculated to almost 11%. But in London, it's 18%. And in Toronto, it's 22%. So for us, it was exciting to kind of see where we could focus some energies on. We just think that that is super helpful and can help drive some of our decisions on how best to move forward. Jen, do you want to take this one?
So onto some of the gaps, and we just want to say, so these are gaps that have jumped out at us that are maybe things that we've seen and that we've been maybe frustrated about for a few years. I know with some of the questions that we've had tonight, there are other gaps that are going to jump out at all of you that we might not have noticed. So that doesn't mean it shouldn't be addressed. You should address whatever your concerns are and hopefully improve this plan. But just to, these are things that we really notice. And one of them is we really need to make sure that we get our private tree protected. So almost 60% of our urban forest is on private tree, or is on private lands. So that means if we don't have a way to protect these trees, that means that we can't protect almost 60% of our urban forest. It's not possible. So we know it's a really hard and awkward and difficult decision, or conversation, but I think it's one that we have to have. Just because that 60%, it's not possible. We can't depend on public lands and have a healthy urban forest at the same time. We have to depend on all of us collectively pitching in to help out, which means that we need some protection measures for all of our trees that are on private lands. I mean, I remember when I first planted my trees, most of which are pretty big now when we moved into our house, I was like, we can't move until the trees are big enough that they're a pain in the butt to cut down. That was I'm like, we can't do that. And now they are big, past big enough for that. But imagine if there was, and we're probably not moving anywhere anyway, but imagine if you plant a tree and you know that it will be there because it's protected. We don't have that right now, so we need to have that conversation. The private tree protection is mentioned in the draft strategy as a tool that can be used, but like lots of the language in the guts of the draft is good, but there isn't a strong action associated with it. So we need a commitment to make sure that our private trees are protected.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another gap, when we've talked about this, we need to aim high. So currently our tree canopy coverage is at 21.2%. The goal by 2050 is 30%. And that's just not good enough. Even in the draft itself, it talks about how 30 to 40% tree canopy coverage is the minimum needed to support basic watershed function. And in the draft, they compared our tree canopy coverage to others. And then we've also included another layer of the goals that other cities have presented for themselves. And I just, have to say that a lot of these communities have started these conversations much earlier, right? Guelph started it in 2013, where they had a plan. Oakville started in 2008. Toronto's plan started in 2012. So for us, waffling is not an option. We just can't buy time when we're talking about having large mature trees. So we just, we need to lead right now. We need to build our climate resiliency, and we won't get those benefits if we don't have those trees. So the time to aim high and move fast. Another gap in the strategy was just kind of acknowledging the roles we all play. In the strategy, they talk about what the city can do and what the developers can do. And that makes sense. It's a city draft, it's a city, entity. But for us, to be bold, to be inspiring, we need to aim high, will include all of us as stewards, as carers of trees, whether it's just increasing our own education, telling our friends and family about the importance of trees, planting trees, caring for the existing tree canopy. There's lots of opportunities there. To have a bold plan, the city can't do it alone. So we just wanted that to be acknowledged as well. Here's one that we're very focused on as well, is about equity and equal coverage. So with the Trees Please and going out and doing tree inventorying and collecting air quality data since 2016, we've been in certain neighborhoods, mostly the lower city. And so in 2016, when we were in Beasley, we calculated the tree canopy coverage to be about 12%. And in McQuestion in 2017, it was about 18.8%. But on certain streets like Roxborough Avenue, it was down to 11.3%. In Parkview in 2019, the tree canopy coverage was calculated to be about 12.6%. So having trees planted in these neighborhoods where it's a lot of concrete, a lot of hard impervious surfaces will take commitment. But these neighborhoods have low tree canopy coverage, and all residents should absolutely have access to quality green space, to large mature trees. And we're not reinventing the wheel. In Toronto's strategic plan, in their urban forest strategy plan, their second strategic goal is to achieve equitable distribution of their urban forests, increasing the canopy where it's most needed. Those locations are prioritized for tree planting. So they have, focused on the spots that need more trees, and away they go. Trees are for everyone. That's the basic message of this. And then another gap that was identified in the strategy, but we want to be emphasized, is just mandatory staff training across departments, including planning. Going out and doing tree inventorying, we saw this time and time again where publicly owned trees were being damaged by whippersnapper or weed whacker damage. And just think about the cost of that, right? The cost of the tree, the cost to plant the tree, the cost to, whatever maintenance and watering. Young trees like this get really stressed out really quickly. It's hard to be a street tree. It's hard to be a tree in a park. There's sometimes things like high salt exposure to poor air quality. Somebody comes by and rips off branches. Those kinds of things will quickly stress out a tree. And then we've got city staff out here whose job is to maintain the grass and cut the grass, but also, they do this. They're basically damaging city infrastructure. And we want, mandatory staff training so that this stuff doesn't happen. And how do we support that staff so it doesn't have to happen? I mean, if you look at the image on the very left, like there is not a lot of grass there, and yet that tree is damaged. And another thing around city staff training was in the draft itself. They talked about how the growth management division of the Planning and Economic Development Department, they carry out the final inspections to make sure that developers have done proper plantings that are consistent with the approved the landscape plans. Those inspectors that go out to check out those trees that have been planted, they're not required to have like a forestry background. They don't have arborist qualifications, and they're the ones evaluating the trees. They're looking at the tree species. They're looking at other factors that would impact the health of that tree or the health of the trees. So for us, it's not just like, the training of the staff has to be across the board. And we are definitely pushing for that, because it is very frustrating to see the damage on the ground and then it just goes up from there.
So this is a big gap that is near and dear to my heart. So we have some really great woodlands. And so when I say an urban woodland, I mean like the escarpment and some of our parks that have woodlands in them. And right now, and we know that these spaces provide tremendous services to all of us and to our communities. They provide, in addition to the ecosystem services and habitat for critters, they also provide spaces for people to get out and explore nature right in their neighborhood. There is like zero attention, zero TLC to these urban woodlands. And a lot, like they're lovely spaces. We've seen some of them, we saw red-tailed hawk nests in them. We've seen ravens flying overhead. We've seen Cooper's hawk. Like we've seen, the diversity is incredible. During migratory season, it's just full of life. And then any other time of year, you can always find something. Like it's impressive, I guess. I say this, and I can admit that when I first started visiting some of these different spaces, I was surprised at how nice they are and how many like spring wildflowers we could find in them and stuff like that. But there is zero attention to them. The only attention that any of these spaces is getting is what I'm doing with the Naturalist Club at Captain Cornelius Park. So there's about like a 7-acre woodland at Captain Cornelius. And it's a neat space. There's some neat like limestone ridge features, like little baby escarpment in it, but there's also some pretty good diversity, and there is a lot of native, but it has like it's almost like a protective barrier of buckthorn around it. And so, we've created some nice pollinator habitat that's doing really well. But we've also, especially this fall, had a really concentrated effort at taking down the buckthorn. And we have now, just with our little team of volunteers, removed enough buckthorn that in the spring, we're going to be able to plant about 100 trees and shrubs, so native trees and shrubs. But that's the only love that any of these spaces are getting across the city. Like this is tremendous municipal infrastructure, if you want to think of it that way. And, like the natural capital, if we want to think of it as like, like buildings being allowed to just fall apart unnecessarily. So this is something that, again, it's in the body of the report, but then there aren't really good, strong, even recommended actions to go with it. And we think there really needs to be some good city leadership to help guide all of us. I think a lot of us will come out and help, and stay tuned because there's more work to do at Cornelius that I could use some help with. And then from there, hopefully we can move on to another woodland. But we can't do this piecemeal. We need some overall leadership from the city to make this happen in a more concentrated way. So this is a commitment, I guess, from the city for this. And then one thing that was kind of shocking, that you'd think would just be almost understood, was that there wasn't a big push to have native trees planted. So again, maybe it's understood, but we think that needs to be like front and center, that yes, trees that are planted are native. And that is the first choice, and most cases the only choice. And again, we're hoping that the city will show some leadership with this. They already do. The trees that are planted through our community tree plantings, so in parks, are native species from a good source. Street trees are a bit more questionable, but we think that they can go a step farther in showing leadership in directing developers and contractors that they have to plant native, plant the biggest species that will fit in the space, and kind of show leadership at that level, because again, that will then have far more of an impact than anywhere that we can be, and that will be the standard. So if the city kind of shows that leadership and makes it the standard, that helps with the conversation about, yes, we want oaks in our backyards, and we want, like, I have a tulip tree and a basswood in my little urban lot. So, if we're seeing it from the city as that's what they are doing, and us talking about it, it just helps to keep the conversation going and for it to just become the standard and the norm. And that's what we need to happen. And with the planting, when trees need to come down because they're hazard trees or whatever, we want it to be a diameter replacement, not a one-to-one replacement. So right now, if say a nice big mature, maybe even bigger, that's just as big as my screen goes, a tree needs to come down, they could plant a whip. So you're losing all of those benefits and all of that canopy in one fell swoop, and you're not getting that, depending on the species, for another 50, 60, 70 years. So we think it needs to be a diameter replacement, not a one-to-one replacement.
Absolutely.
And then, okay, so this is normal for our city, but it's something that we've seen over and over. We get lots of great plans that are developed. There's strategies, they're passed by council, and then there isn't any funding or metrics or timelines or any implementation or commitment to move beyond just getting the strategy approved and check mark and it's done. And so we think that our city has mastered the art of the plan and then doing nothing. And we think, we know that we're in a crisis. This can't happen anymore. It's not an option. We have to act, and we have to act now. Seeing all of you on this call when we can't even be together, and you're taking time and asking some fantastic questions that we haven't thought of yet, shows like how committed all of us are. So we just need the city to also be committed, and so we need a firm commitment, because right now there's nothing. The only commitment was to develop this plan, and within it, the text is not bad. There are gaps, and probably more gaps, as I mentioned, that some of you have mentioned tonight that we haven't thought of yet. But the guts of it aren't too bad. But then when it comes to even the recommended actions, no strength at all. So we need a firm commitment that this is going to turn into action and implementation at lots of different levels, like policy level, to planting, to the on the ground work, to helping to coordinate all of us so that little things like what we're doing at Cornelius are happening across the city. Like we can't be everywhere. So if the city can coordinate, so we need these commitment to implementation to happen at all levels. So we need, commitment for dedicated funding, timelines for when things are going to happen and when implementation is going to happen.
Yeah.
And then just a kind of a bit of a summary of what some of our key issues now at this point anyway is critical private tree protection. The canopy target 30% is as a minimum is not acceptable as a target for an ambitious goal. Municipal staff training for all departments that work with trees. So this includes planning, because they're, as Juby mentioned, like they're making the final call on what's happening on the ground, and yet they're not foresters. So we need a base level of training for everybody. A commitment to steward and give some love to our urban woodlands. Have to plant native and ensure that when we're planting that it becomes an equitable canopy coverage across the whole city. And then the timeline, metrics, and funding to make sure that all of this happens.
Mm-hmm.
So just as a summary.
So Jen, we were going to take a little question break, but I'm wondering, we just have a couple more slides after that. I wonder if we should go through the slides and finish off with all the questions.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Good idea.
Great. Okay, so the action items. So we've listed a couple of actions. Definitely, if you can attend that virtual public consultation session on Tuesday, that would be amazing. And like Jen was saying, you could ask questions beforehand so that they're prepared. And they also have on that Engage Hamilton website under the urban forest strategy, a survey and some polls you can fill out. One of the things you could also do is contact your city councilor and just tell them about the things you want to see in the strategy, whether it's, what are holding them accountable? What are we going to do around public or private tree protection? What are we going to do about funding? Whatever your concerns are, send them to your counselor. Let them know you are concerned, that you want an urban forest. You want a strong urban forest. You want a strong, bold strategy. And also, while you're doing it, copy and paste the senior planner, Kathy, as well. And then your comments can be included in the public consultation process as well, just be added. Plant a tree, whether it's through the city street tree program. We're going to be doing a community tree planting in April and in the fall as well. So stay tuned for that. Talk to your neighbors and friends and family about the importance of trees. If you hear conversations about, oh, I don't like that tree, it's too buggy or whatever, talk about how it will leave a hole in the canopy and what that means for the birds, what it means for shade. Just having these conversations about why our urban forest is so important. Those are our action items.
And sorry, if I can just jump in, because I love this, but when you're talking to your neighbors, if they complain about, like the tree is buggy, well, that means it's bringing the birds. And if you don't like the mess that it's leaving, they can do the Doug Tallamy 10-step program, which is to step 10 paces back from your tree, and then you don't see it. You just see a lovely overall tree.
That's right.
And the birds that are coming to the tree.
Yes. See the forest for the trees. Yes, for sure. That's a great idea. I love that idea. So what else can we do? So we're doing a couple of things. So at Environment Hamilton, we're doing something in the works now. We have collected tree seeds, white pines, Kentucky coffee seeds, and red oak acorns. And we created these 3 videos. I'll send you the link when I email you a bunch of stuff at the end. These 3 videos are on Environment Hamilton's YouTube channel, and we have the seeds. So in March, we're going to be promoting and distributing seeds to folks who would like to care for some trees. We also have some seedlings as well. So, just trying to get more seeds out there. We know that there's huge potential, like Jen was saying, around increasing our tree canopy coverage on private properties. So an ambitious plan means we all need to be doing stuff. So what I'll do is I'll email you when I email you out all the links to other stuff, you can just respond to me and say, add me to the Trees from Seeds email list. And when it comes time, we'll be in contact about how you can get your hands on some seeds.
And then something else is helping with work at places like Captain Cornelius Park. So, this is getting rid of invasives, so buckthorn primarily there. And let me tell you, that is a feel-good thing to do. And then we're also going to be planting. So we're going to be planting there in April as well. So, and then hopefully then moving on to somewhere else. So there are those kinds of activities that are coming up. So if you're interested, then it'll be in the same contact. You can, I think it's Juby's contacts. You can contact Juby and let her know that you're interested, and we can hook you up.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So those are all our slides, and we'll take questions now.
Okay, great, because you have lots of them. So
Good.
Wayne asks, what is the ideal tree or trees for urban planting?
That's a good question, Wayne. It kind of depends if they're on private property. I would suggest things like where basically on private properties, generally like in backyards, they're not exposed to things like assault as much. So there seems to be a little bit more flexibility in terms of the kinds of trees. White pines, for instance, are very sensitive to salt. Um, so things like white pines, but in urban spaces, red oaks seem to be actually a little bit salt tolerant as a native tree. So we know the city's been planting lots of those. Um, and then, we just have some favorite trees. There's lots of great oaks, there's lots of great maples. Um, we kind of, we kind of like evergreens because the city doesn't actually plant a lot of evergreens because, sight lines and not, what if someone hides underneath an evergreen, those kinds of things. So, yeah, there's lots of great options. We do, being part of our Carolinian forest, we have about 70 different kinds of trees. So native trees. So lots of options there. Jen, do you want to?
It depends on the site as well, and what your, I guess, goals are for the property. So I think, making sure that we get the right tree in the right place and looking at, what are the conditions. Like Juby mentioned, if it's a backyard tree, there's lots of options, because you can kind of baby it a bit more than street trees. So it's really hard. You can't really give an answer because there's so much, it depends. Which is why, like the forestry folks, they have 40 pieces of data that they look at when they're looking at what kind of tree might fit.
Okay, this is a question from Summer. And Summer says, at my school, my environmental club was fighting with the city to have native trees planted on our school grounds as opposed to non-native cultivars. How can we ensure trees being planted by the city are appropriate? On city property, that is.
And it's on city property. Okay.
On city property.
So this is one of the things that if we can get it native is the standard, then that would help through the strategy. We have heard that some folks, when they're talking with the city about what their street tree might be, so whether it's a school or a home, they do sometimes have issues with the city. Right now, I think the best thing to do is just keep demanding. So if you stand firm and you're like, no, I want this tree and this tree and this tree, and that's it, that seems to be what works. And then, tell your counselor, and maybe tell the counselor where you live and the counselor at the school, if they're different, that, this is like, we should be able to pick native species, because homeowners can. So, make sure that the word gets out and then just stand firm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, this is a question from Cameron. Cameron says, I know that the current report does not break down tree canopy cover by neighborhood, but do you think that the data exists and that we might be able to ask the city for it?
We have asked them that it might exist in bits and bytes. I think, they've done a number of tree inventorying over the years. I think their challenge that they've told us is that they're in different programs, or that there's different things that were recorded, or I don't know if there are actual by neighborhood that's accessible. So that's something we've been asking for, and we're always asking for maps for them, and they say they have some data, and they do have some really great data, but I haven't seen it. And we know we've asked for details around their tree canopy coverage, and I don't think that they really have done something very like throughout the entire city, unfortunately. So.
But I think if we keep asking for it, like I think, if it's not just us asking for it, if it's everybody asking for this and saying this is so important for our neighborhood planning, we have to have this information for our neighborhood planning, then I think that will help, because us just having a draft urban forest strategy is a result of people saying we have to have this. So if all of us keep asking for it. And if we keep doing trees please, neighborhood by neighborhood, then we end up getting that neighborhood by neighborhood. But that's small scale. It doesn't help everybody. So make sure that's a key part of this questions, because that's critical for any future planning that all of us want to do.
Mhm.
Okay, Sue asks, what is the needed investment to get the target canopy coverage? It makes reference both to the strategy target and the target that we talked about tonight, which I guess we would say is the dream big, ambitious target.
Yes. It will require a lot of funding, especially in these spots where it's mostly concrete. We've seen with Toronto, for instance, they have done a number of tree plantings using technology called soil cells. And what they do is it's basically like wallless boxes that kind of fit on top of each other, so you can actually move through pipe, like build it around infrastructure, existing like underground pipes and things. So generally when the ground is already being ripped up and things like that, you can use soil cell technology, which is just like putting these supports in, and then you fill each box, wallless box, with soil. And then when you plant a tree, they can use all of that soil. And it's not compressed the way it is, when we plant trees in parks or on green right-of-ways. And we know that, I couldn't find an actual price, that's like, this is what it costs, because it depends on a number of factors. But, we saw numbers of anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000 to $10,000 per tree by the time the project had finished in these different areas of Toronto. So it is very pricey. And, forestry has told us things like, if we had $10,000, where would we put those trees? Like, getting the biggest bang for their buck. So we know that these things are not cheap. They're not for the faint-hearted. But at the end of the day, if this is what we have to do, we have to do it, because climate change impacts us all. And now that we are losing more and more soft surfaces and they're becoming hard surfaces, we need those trees, even just for the stormwater management alone. So,
and if we don't do it now, it's going to cost even more.
yes. Exactly.
Okay, I have another question for you. This is from Adrian. Adrian asks, does the draft forestry strategy indicate whether or not they will force residents to receive a street tree on the city boulevard portion, wherever one does not exist? And then they add, it seems that this would be prudent given the climate emergency. And I'm going to say I couldn't agree more.
We totally agree with that. They have never used that kind of language around, like, they're really about like, let's incentivize, it's already free. We know in the draft, they've alluded to in 2019 that they did some kind of outreach for tree plantings in city right-of-ways, and they did not get a positive resulted from that. And we also know through forestry that, when a big development happens, and it's forestry's job to go in and plant trees as those houses are being popped up. If they don't do it before people move in, the amount, like the rate of tree acceptance drops like 50%. So we don't think the city forestry folks, I don't think they're pursuing this idea of like forcing people, but incentivizing it maybe, right? Like maybe, we have stormwater fees idea where maybe we can incentivize homeowners. Like, if you put a tree out, then we can do X, Y, and Z for you. But it would be delightful. We've talked about like gorilla planting trees, and just like, surprise, you have a free tree, and you're the owner of this beautiful tree. Congratulations to you. But we don't think the forestry, I don't think there's plans for forestry to kind of do a harder line, harder push, even though we absolutely agree that people should just have trees.
I was just going to add, there are lots of great comments around creative ways to raise awareness about trees and why they're wonderful. So there's been a suggestion that it would be nice to have more labeling in spaces like Gage Park, and a really neat example from John Hanna about telling a tree story. So he uses an example. I'm just going to read it because it's kind of cute. Hi, I'm a river birch. I was planted in 2003. I've hosted 3 squirrel drays, a Baltimore Oriole nest in 2015, and chipping sparrow nests every year since 2016. I am resistant to disease that affects European white birch. Grow me instead. So lots of great ideas about raising awareness about trees. And then another comment, and this is from an anonymous attendee who asked the question earlier about engagement with Indigenous community on the urban forest strategy. And it's just a comment that there is a native buckthorn and expressing concern that we need to be careful not to eradicate that one. So we have lots of knowledgeable people on the call tonight, which is great.
That is great. And yes, you're right. There is a native buckthorn. So it's not as common. And in Captain Cornelius Park, it is definitely the European buckthorn. But you're right. Yes, we do have to watch out.
And I have to read this question out because I see we have someone from the Clean Air Partnership on the session, and they're a great organization for those who don't know them. And their question, I think, is one kind of disbelief. Hamilton doesn't have a private tree bylaw. So Jen and Juby, do you want to comment on that one at all?
Yeah, we don't. There have been attempts, not by us, but there have been attempts to bring it forward, and it has been shot down by council. So that's why we need everybody to say we support private tree protection. We need private tree protection because otherwise we can only protect 40% of our urban forest. So council is not supportive of it at this point. So we need, because they're worried that none of their constituents would support it. So we need to show them that constituents do support it.
Yeah.
And I've had a couple of questions that are kind of along the same theme, so I'm going to kind of combine them. There was one question from John around, that positive push towards infill development in the core of the city. Does that cause concerns for available space for new trees and potential loss of existing ones? How do we strike the balance between these two essential climate responses? And then related to that, Sue asks a similar question around the conflicting goal of getting more solar panels on homes versus the shade from trees. And then, considerable thought of how new houses should be sited on an east-west axis to enable good solar gain. So good questions about conflicts between trees and other, I guess what you could call sustainability, climate resilience trends with the physical form of our, I guess, human built environment.
So I can maybe start and then pass it on to Juby. So for the solar panels, yes, I know that's a concern at my house because I now have shade everywhere. Because all my, I used to have full sun and then my trees grew. So now I think in my house, just the way my house is situated, it wouldn't work. But maybe there can be, so in that situation for solar panels on houses, maybe there's some kind of compromise about can this, and you guys know way more about this than I do, Sue, but maybe there can be like the solar panels are put where it best catches the sun, and maybe there's a tree in like the opposite side of the yard. I'm not sure if something like that would work. I think when it's not a house, I think you can definitely have both. It's just making sure that you look at where can both be suited so that you still get the same benefits from the tree and from the solar panels. And then in terms of infilling and development, that's right. But again, I think you can situate infill development so that maybe it's not a whole field of trees that we get in the middle of the city because of this development. But I think you can situate the development so that there's still some trees. So every development has some kind of tree allocation that has to be given. And the developments are just planned around that. So I think with that, you can have some of both.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would just add on things like you've probably all heard the city talking about second dwelling units and some of the opportunities there to do things like laneway houses. And I know there are rules around lot coverage and percentage lot coverage that's allowed. So hopefully, because I totally hear that concern that we could lose those planting opportunities. So hopefully, with some of the gentle density, we'll see the opportunities there to strike a good balance. Okay, I have to read this question out because it's almost rhetorical, but maybe not. But Nancy asks, why does Hamilton always aim low? I don't know if either, and I'm sure that's in reference to the target canopy cover.
Yeah.
And it's just acknowledging what the pain we all feel. Yes.
Yes, because I think, yes, I thought so, Nancy, because as residents and constituents, we don't aim low, we aim high, and somehow the result ends up often being low. Yes.
Okay, this question is from Lennox, and Lennox asks, should a private tree protection include trees which are considered invasive? For example, if I have a huge Norway maple and really would like to cut it down to replace with a native oak tree, should the invasive tree be protected?
No. But I guess that's part of the conversation that needs to happen around protecting. So I don't think so. I think there should be an exemption for invasive, in particular, trees. Norway maple being a bit different, but a lot of invasive trees, they get to be big, but because they're weed trees, they actually become hazard trees fast. We don't have the lifespan with them. So yes, we do want to take them down, and maybe we can get the oak going, and then take down the Norway along the way. But yes, I think as part of the conversation, we need to address invasives that make up far too much of our canopy, and replace them. So I think so, that yes, Lennox, you should be able to take down your Norway maple. But I think that also needs to be part of the conversation.
I think other private tree protections have kind of this like scale of like what they'll protect, diameter and species, and invasives are low on that kind of protection scale. For sure.
This is from C&D, and they say the town of Dundas had a tree plan that protected trees on key public and private areas. When we tried to use these protections to save trees in a proposed development, we were told that harmonization would put Dundas under Hamilton rules, which meant no protection. So Juby and Jen, any comment on that?
Yes, I think we lost something similar in Ancaster too at amalgamation. And so that's where we need to show the city that there maybe are some things that might already exist in our history that we can pull out and start applying across the whole city.
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be consistent, right? Across the whole city. So.
Okay, and then here's another question. Sorry, and for folks, we've got lots of questions. So I know there are people who've asked multiple questions, and I'm going to just go through and get some folks whose questions haven't been asked yet, if that's okay. So Amy asks, with food security concerns in mind, what about prioritizing edible native trees?
Hi, Amy. So I think there is definitely a space for those. We see a lot of that at the urban farm, all kinds of cool edible trees, and we've talked about doing that at Cornelius as well. And so I think they should be added to, or maybe upped in when we all talk about tree options that people can plant. Because I think we forget to pass on some of that and talk about how some of our trees actually are edible, whether they produce fruit or the flowers or whatever. So I think that's up to all of us to make sure those make the list when people are looking at them.
Okay, and we have a question from Zoe Green. Hi, Zoe. And Zoe asks, what's the latest on a tree cutting bylaw across Hamilton? And I think this is an important one for us to emphasize.
So that would be through a private tree protection?
Nope, what's the latest on the tree cutting bylaw? Yeah, I think so, private tree cutting bylaw.
So there's the bylaw to theoretically protect woodlands that I think are bigger than 4 hectares. That's it.
Mhm.
There's no protection for anything else. And there is no, I think for a lot of counselors, there is very little appetite for it. So that's why we need to make sure, like tree cutting, tree protection, that is increased in what we need to talk about and what we need to prioritize.
Mhm.
Because if they're already there, we want to keep them.
Yes, I think in the draft they talk about how there's not really much leverage that the city can do around tree retention. So when a developer has a plan, they don't really have, the city doesn't really have the ability to say, well, you know, so there's definitely a lot of work to be done and big conversations. And it's going to be hard because, yeah, like Jen was saying, there's not really a huge appetite with our city council around having these big discussions.
Can I just add too, I think one thing that we do know is that people, Hamiltonians have made it clear. I know that there was a survey done and there seems to be, and I don't know how widespread the survey was, but certainly people who took the time support the need for a private tree protection bylaw. And I think that's a huge one in terms of what Zoe's speaking to. So I think it's worth us emphasizing to everybody that if you believe that's needed, that's a really crucial part of what you need to be telling the city in your feedback on this plan and what you need to be saying to your ward councillor, because we know we need that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Linda.
Okay, so Candy is asking, do you have a great tree infographic to share regarding the benefits so we can share it on social media, etc.?
Oh, I could dig out this one that we created that kind of just talked about a number of trees, and I can send that along in this email that's just getting bigger and bigger. Well, yeah, that's a great question, Candy.
And we've also had a request, someone has asked whether the presentation slides will be available too.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So I will send out the link to this webinar and then upload the slides and our action sheets. You'll get in your email, but also be on our website, which I'll send you the link for.
And another request for information from Hibbs. Juby, can you create a report I can share with neighbors that estimate the economic impact of a street tree and a backyard tree?
Oh, a street tree and a backyard tree. That I think would be quite similar.
Yeah, I was saying, like, we could probably just do a tree,
Yeah.
like an eye tree.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is another neat idea from Candy. And Candy says, do we have anyone like volunteers who are handy with Photoshop or something similar to get homeowners to see a front yard with a tree planted? And she says, seeing is believing.
Mm-hmm.
How fun would that be? So we don't have that, but if anybody here does, or if you know people, we could probably provide the graphics that then somehow get mushed together. So that would be awesome to be able to show people how fantastic it is to sit under your tree in your yard, which is much, much, much better at cooling than sitting like under a tent to provide shade. The tree is way better. So yes, let's make that happen if we just need help with that.
And Ruth has a question. She asks, what advice can you give homeowners for succession planning in their own yards? For instance, I have a really old maple in my front yard. What can I do to make sure that I'm not suddenly treeless?
Plant a tree now. I mean, in another spot where it's not going to compete and stuff like that. But you need to get something else going now. so that you're ready for when that tree needs to come down.
Okay, and Michelle asks, why not more trees in the annual beds around the city? So many of these annuals are not great for pollinators. Our birds might
Yeah.
like more trees and bushes, and pollinators might like perennials.
Yes. So we have talked with the city about this, and I think it would be great for them to hear somebody besides me saying that. Some of what I have heard is that it's a training thing, and it's just easier if they do annuals and just rip everything out at the end of the year than training people to not rip out plants that we want to keep. So what I've suggested is, well, to do the training and maybe still have some annuals in places that you wouldn't, like still have that pop of color at the front of the bed, or in places like little boulevard plantings, like where it's little boulevard car. Maybe annuals can go in there, because we wouldn't want pollinators to kind of get stuck in that anyway. So yes, we just need them to hear it from more than just me. So they've heard it, and they need to keep hearing it, that we are open to having different species planted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Elizabeth shares a comment. She says, a way to incentivize would be a credit on stormwater portion of the water bill if people allowed trees on their property. Elizabeth, we totally agree. The one problem is we don't have a stormwater fee in Hamilton yet. So Environment Hamilton has been pushing for that. And if you believe that that's the right thing to do, visit our website, environmenthamilton.org, and under Take Action, there's a petition you can sign so we can get that stormwater fee. And we agree that to combine that with what Juby was referencing earlier, and incentives for positive action is exactly what we need.
Yeah, we definitely need to think of creative ways of, generating more income, and, because the city is always great about, like what Jen was saying, approving a plan as long as it doesn't have any funding attached to it. And so, a stormwater fee could potentially do that. Yeah, so.
Okay, we have a question from Akira. Is there any possibility for planting more trees in abandoned lots and locations? Century Manor, for example, is a huge land plot, and it's been empty for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely something we have talked about, and looking at that slide we were talking about earlier around all the industrial and institutional low density residential, like there's so many of these opportunities. I don't know where the city's at in terms of planting trees and thinking of creative spots, but hopefully we could, if we have a high goal, they will be forced to look at spaces that they might not have looked at the first go around. Yeah, but great idea.
Okay, and we have a question from our friend Randy K. Hey, Randy. Will private nurseries be held accountable if selling invasive species?
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Because it's really hard to get the message across about how bad invasives are when people are like, I just saw it at my nursery yesterday. So how bad can it be? I mean, that would be so lovely to see. I don't know how you make that happen, but whoa, that would be fantastic to see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, and I have to say, there are tons of questions. So Jen and Juby, I'll leave it to you. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of them tonight, but I'm happy to keep reading them if you're happy to keep answering. And maybe what we can say now is that if we don't get through all of them, I know that they'll be, I'm pretty sure they get documented, like we have access to them through the recording of the meeting. So we can do our best, where we know the names to try to get back to people. But I just so people on the call are aware, there's just an overwhelming number of comments. So this one is from Anne, who asks, to what degree do your agencies in this and the city of Hamilton identify people and organizations in these tree poor areas to get involved in the process? And Anne also asks, are there any barriers to this happening?
Good question.
That's a great question. So, and when we're doing like our Trees Please, for instance, we show up at neighborhood associations. We've dropped off flyers in the past. Definitely a good question, and something we struggle with for sure. Um, for instance, our free tree giveaways that we do specifically as part of Trees Please, that's just for that neighborhood. We recently just decided to do home delivery. So we make it as easy as possible for folks to get a free tree. Those numbers are very limited. It does take a lot of time, and that's an ongoing question for sure. These things, I just think about we're working on some projects trying to get more trees in these urban spaces, and they always take time. And yeah, so great question, and it's something ongoing that we try, and we definitely when we can pick up new tools and try and kind of change the way we do things in order to reach as many people as we possibly can, for sure.
And we just had a request, someone who said they joined late and wanted to see or hear the details for the Tuesday city meeting again. They said seeing the slide would be great, but I think Jen and Juby, you also are going to be emailing out that action sheet as well, right?
Yep.
With the details for everyone?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, let me see here.
Linda, if there's a lot of questions, I don't know, Jen, if we have time in the next little bit, if we don't get through them all, we could just hop back on in a webinar and record, or a meeting, and record the questions, or like read the questions and have our answers, and then just record that, and then we can send it out to everybody. That might be easier than trying to go through all the questions tonight, just looking at the time. These are great questions, and this is amazing, just having you all here and so passionate about trees. It warms our cold little hearts. So thank you.
Okay, so sorry, did you want to wrap it up, Juby, or do you want me to?
Well, we can do.
I'm noticing a lot of these are comments too. So there is one that I wanted to, because I think it's a good point. And this is Adrian, who basically is thanking us for our organizational, quote unquote, social forestry work. And I think that's a neat way of describing what we've been doing, and asks, how can we encourage a culture of social forestry in every neighborhood? And they comment, this would help to democratize and distribute the strategic forestry effort beyond simply waiting for inherently slow government structures to act.
Yeah. So that's a great question. It's a big question. Thank you so much for that phrasing as well. These things take a lot of time, and at first it was like, oh, maybe we can get more trees into schools, and we did that for a couple of years, and that was very challenging. Environment Hamilton is undergoing right now like a neighborhood climate action, neighborhood-based work, and through these conversations, obviously we can't be there at every conversation, but if we just start talking about it in general and try and network, try to keep building these connections so that, people know about all these programs that you can get a free tree from, or, ways of caring for existing trees. Yeah, it's not an easy or tidy answer, but, just even having tonight's discussion and with all you here and the response and these great quality questions, really shows us that people are passionate about trees. And this is the time more than ever, during COVID, we see more people out, we see more people using the parks and the green spaces and having these quality spaces for folks, and they're paying attention and they're tuned in. And yeah, there's just lots of hopeful moments throughout the landscape that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly too on this one, just in terms of democratizing. I think some of the things that we're trying to do as well with growing trees from seed and getting people who are willing to grow a row of trees in their garden as a really great way to, I mean, they're small trees, but they're still native trees. And so we're also, I think, trying to figure out how do we help people to be able to reforest their neighborhood in ways that anybody could access, it, just in terms of the affordability of doing it. And it does, I think, ultimately become a very social thing, but combine that with all the other things that Juby and Jen have already been talking about. So it feels like there are some good steps that we can all take, that we can work on together moving forward, to get to where we want to be.
And I think if I can just add to that, I think there are small and little and big things. I guess with any of these actions, there are a range of things that we can do. But I think with the trees and seeing it with like our pollinator work as well, if we keep the conversation going. So I'm not big on, like, I don't do a lot with social media myself, but it's a way that all of us, so not just dependent on like the organizations, but all of us can keep the conversation going. So if people, because then people are seeing it multiple times, and then it helps to resonate, as well as things like little signs in the parks, or even we had the trees program that all about how I planted a native of my sick. And at first we noticed people stopping. We were like, oh, are they gonna, like, just assuming, oh, my internet is unstable. Okay, we just, as we were like, oh, is that somebody letting their dog go and are they gonna pick it up? No, it's people reading the sign. So many people stop and read the sign, and then they look at the tree. Fortunately, it's a very nice looking sycamore tree. And they're like, oh, that's nice. So, you know, I don't want signage everywhere. Like, you don't want to be over signed, but we have noticed, and we also have a poster sign up at Captain Cornelius, because so many people were asking us why we were cutting the forest down, and we would just say that we're cutting out the weeds and planting better trees and things like that. And we have a poster that's at the park, that's just living at the park, that describes what's happening and why this much of the forest has been cut down. And we see people stop and ask us what we're doing, but when we're not there, we're seeing that people read the signs as well. So whether that leads to, actually, I do know that that has led to engagement, because I got a message from a mom who wants her kids to come and help with the tree planting that's coming in the spring. So those are like, so we have like, you know, ways through like kitchen table meetings and things like that, but there are also almost like the just everyday, like, passing messages along that doesn't have to take a ton of time, that ends up being super helpful.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, just looking through the comments, there's lots of great feedback and reflection on how important the role is of community in building a healthy urban forest. So I think that's really great to see in the comments that people are making, and I can see people are talking about their neighborhoods, and I see Cherie Selway talking about North End neighbors and the committee that they have that's focused on climate change and some of the action there. So hopefully some of you are connecting, and we'll continue to work with you to raise awareness about what's happening between neighborhoods. Jen and Juby, I think we've probably covered some of the core questions.
Oh, yay.
Okay, and so we're going to, I'm committing, and Juby and I, for this, but we're going to read through some of the, like, the rest of the comments, because just the quick glances that I had, and sorry I couldn't read as they were coming up, but the quick glance, there's some really good ideas in there that I think we want to capture. So we're going to read through these, and what we can do is, if there are other questions that, like if there are still a number of other questions that haven't been able to be addressed, then maybe we can do a bit of a Q&A, and follow it along, and, you know, you'll end up getting the link. So that could be a way that we could help make sure that all of these questions are addressed. And some of the questions might be able to be addressed by the city on Tuesday as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we did it. We did it. Thank you. This has been amazing and inspiring and so good. Yeah, this has just been amazing. And thank you so much for being here, and your contributions, your questions, and your comments. And yeah, for sure, we're gonna take a look, and I'm excited to look through all the comments. So yeah, I guess you'll be hearing from us soon. I'll send out the action sheets. Maybe we'll see you online virtually on the 9th. Yeah, there's a
And
lot of,
hopefully we'll be able to see you in person sometime soon too.
that's right.
But I wanted to thank everybody too, like for sticking around for what ended up being a long meeting is just fantastic. I would rather have it longer than shorter because there wasn't interest. So this is just so incredible for all of us. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a good night, everybody.
Yes, thank you.